Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time we're traveling back a century to the 1920s, a decade we often call the Roaring Twenties.
Definitely roaring. And for this deep dive, we're taking a look at a really interesting research paper. It shows just how much progress happened in this era.
It's honestly pretty mind-blowing. Like, the economy grew by 42%. Can you even imagine that happening today?
Yeah, 42%. It's a huge number.
Right.
But it's important to remember that it was also a time of, real extremes.
Right, definitely.
So you had like skyrocketing economic growth, but also all this social upheaval going on at the same time.
A lot of change to deal with.
Absolutely. And then, all these technological innovations, which totally changed how people lived their daily lives, but also ended up kind of leading to some problems down the line.
Foreshadowing.
Exactly. So what we're going to do today is explore all these contradictions.
Sounds good.
So, like, what caused this economic boom? What were the consequences?
And, like, how did the Roaring Twenties set the stage for the world we live in today? Those consequences are what I'm most curious about. Like, you see all the flapper dresses and jazz music, and it's easy to get caught up in the romantic image of it all.
Yeah, for sure. It seems glamorous.
But there's got to be more to the story.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Way more.
So let's start with this crazy economic boom. The research says the end of World War I was a big factor there.
Yeah, totally. So basically, when the war ended, factories suddenly switched from making war supplies to making consumer goods.
Oh, so they already had the infrastructure, everything.
Exactly. And suddenly everyone had more money to spend because they weren't rationing anymore.
Makes sense. So you've got factories pumping out cars, refrigerators, radios, things that were like luxury items before.
Yeah, and people are ready to buy.
So it seems like the perfect recipe for economic growth. But was it really that simple? Were there other things happening that made people want all this stuff?
Well, pent-up demand and all this extra production definitely played a part. But this was also when mass advertising really took off.
Ah, the power of marketing.
Exactly. For the first time, people were seeing these glossy magazine ads, showcasing all these new gadgets and conveniences they could buy.
So tempting.
Totally. It made them feel like anything was possible. But it probably also created this sense of, keeping up with the Joneses.
Oh, for sure. That's fascinating. I mean, it's like those early advertising strategies set the stage for our consumer culture today.
Right, definitely. It makes you wonder, though, right? Were there any people back then who were worried about all this consumerism? Or was everyone just, totally focused on progress and getting rich?
That's a really good question. Speaking of progress, let's talk about cars. You can't talk about the 1920s without mentioning cars. This research highlights how Henry Ford's assembly line made cars affordable for pretty much everyone.
Yeah, the Model T.
And there's this crazy statistic. Car ownership went up by, over 200% during this decade.
It was a game changer, yeah. Not just for individuals, but for, the whole structure of society.
I can only imagine.
People could suddenly live further away from their jobs, which led to the rise of the suburbs.
And the impact on all kinds of industries.
Huge. Think about steel, rubber, construction.
So many changes.
It even changed how people dated and socialized, Young people had this new freedom, this mobility they'd never experienced before.
It's funny. My grandmother used to tell me stories about how her family got their first car in the 1920s.
Oh, wow. What did she say?
She said it felt like a whole new world had opened up to them.
I bet. But it also makes you think, right? Did all this rapid change create any anxiety?
Like, people must have been struggling to keep up.
Yeah, a feeling of whiplash.
Totally. We often think of the 1920s as this super optimistic time.
Yeah, all that excitement about the future.
But some people probably felt overwhelmed by it all.
I'm sure they did. All these huge transformations happening so fast.
So, okay, we've got this economic boom, right? Driven by mass production, consumerism, the automobile. But this research paper also mentions some risky financial innovations.
Oh, yeah. And it hints that those might have led to a pretty big crash.
Oh.
So one of the things that popped up was this practice of buying stocks on margin.
What does it even mean?
Basically, people were borrowing money to invest in the stock market, hoping to get rich quick.
That sounds a little reckless. Were there any rules in place to, prevent things from getting out of control?
Well, this was the era of laissez-faire economics.
Laissez-faire.
Yeah, the basic idea was that the government shouldn't interfere with the free market.
So very hands-off.
Exactly. So, yeah, there were some regulations, but nothing like we have today.
So basically, laissez-faire meant let it be. even if things were getting, a little crazy on Wall Street.
Pretty much. And this hands-off approach, while it could be good for innovation and, encouraging people to start businesses, it also allowed for a lot of speculation and risky financial moves.
So maybe laissez-faire isn't always the best strategy when it comes to financial markets.
Yeah, sometimes a little guidance is a good thing.
What happened next? Did all this buy now, pay later with stocks lead to the crash of 1929?
It definitely played a part over speculation and stuff, like overproduction, and then, people started sending less.
So demand went down.
Yeah, and that created, like, the perfect storm,
Right.
When the stock market started falling, all those people who had bought stocks with borrowed money, they had to sell everything to cover their debts.
Oof, not good.
Yeah, which just made prices drop even further.
A total domino effect.
Right, one thing leads to another, and it all just spirals.
And this crash led to what we now call the Great Depression, right?
Exactly. It was, like, really bad. I mean, unemployment went up to 25%.
Not 25%.
Yeah, banks were failing left and right, businesses closing down everywhere. The research paper actually has a table that shows it all, like, really starkly.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
In 1929, the U.S. GDP was, booming over $100 billion.
That's a lot.
Yeah, by 1933, it had crashed to just over $55 billion.
Wow.
It's crazy how fast things change.
That table really shows it, huh? So the Roaring Twenties ended, well, not with a roar, more like a whimper. It really makes you think, could something like that happen again?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Economists and historians are still arguing about that. But it definitely shows how important it is to, like, really understand economic cycles.
Yeah, and the dangers of speculation.
For sure.
Okay, let's move on to something a little lighter.
Right.
Let's talk about the culture of the 1920s. This research mentions flappers, jazz music, the Harlem Renaissance.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
It sounds like there was a cultural revolution going on right alongside all the economic stuff we've been talking about.
Totally. Traditional values were clashing with these modern ideas, especially when it came to women.
Women's roles were changing so much in the 1920s.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the flappers, they were like the symbol of this new era, with their bobbed hair and short skirts and rejecting all those old Victorian norms.
Like total rebels. But what was it about that specific moment in history that allowed for such a big shift in women's roles?
World War I was a big part of it. I mean, with men away fighting, women had to take on jobs that they traditionally hadn't done before.
They kept things running.
Yeah, exactly. They proved they could do it. And that new economic independence, combined with, the horrors of the war and everything, probably made a lot of women want to break free from how things had always been.
To create a new world.
Right.
And it wasn't just fashion and social customs.
Right.
This was also a time of huge artistic growth, especially for African Americans. The research paper talks about the Harlem Renaissance.
Oh, yeah, the Harlem Renaissance was amazing. Such an explosion of art and intellectual energy.
The golden age.
It wasn't just about making, beautiful art and music. It was about challenging racial stereotypes, celebrating Black identity, demanding social justice.
Such an important movement.
It really was. And it's amazing how its impact is still felt today. People are still reading and celebrating figures like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston.
Their work has stood the test of time.
Yeah, it speaks to everyone, love, loss, joy, struggle, all those universal human experiences. But it also really highlights the specific challenges that Black Americans faced during that era.
It's incredible how art can be a force for social change.
It really is.
But alongside all this creativity, there was also this experiment, let's call it, happening at the same time.
Oh, yeah.
Prohibition. The attempt to outlaw alcohol. What were they thinking?
Well, it was a lot of things mixed together, social and political stuff. There were some people who truly believed that alcohol was like the root of all evil.
Interesting.
They thought it caused poverty, domestic violence, all these problems.
A well-intentioned idea.
Maybe. But there were also these powerful groups, often religious, who were really pushing for it to be banned.
Oh, so there were ulterior motives at play?
Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? But obviously it didn't really work out the way they planned. The research talks about speakeasies and organized crime. Seems like Prohibition might have created more problems than it solved.
Yeah, it definitely had unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the big things we can learn from this whole era,
What's that?
That social engineering is really, really hard. It shows what can happen when you try to, legislate morality.
And it makes you think about individual freedom versus government control.
It definitely raises some big questions.
And it's fascinating to me that the 1920s saw both the expansion of women's rights with the suffrage movement and this attempt to control people's behavior with prohibition. It seems kind of contradictory.
It is, but it also shows how complicated social progress can be. It's not always, a straight line from A to B. There are steps forward, steps backward, different groups with different goals, and then you get these unexpected outcomes.
2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Okay, we can't talk about the 1920s without mentioning the suffrage movement. This decades-long fight for women's voting rights finally led to victory in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. It's really inspiring to think about all the work that figures like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton put into this.
Absolutely. Their dedication and perseverance made it possible for millions of women to finally have a voice in politics.
It's crazy to think that there was a time when women couldn't vote. It feels so normal now. It just shows how recent a lot of these basic rights are. It really makes you think, huh? So we've talked about all these massive economic shifts, cultural changes, political movements, all crammed into one decade. And what blows my mind is how much the 1920s still feel relevant today, even though it was like 100 years ago.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I mean, if you know where to look, you can see echoes of the 1920s everywhere.
Like where?
Well, we're living in a time of insane technological change, just like they were.
Yep.
We're dealing with inequality, social and economic, just like back then.
Yeah, still haven't figured that one out.
Nope. And, the world is changing so fast right now, so much uncertainty. It feels kind of similar to what they were going through.
So it's almost like a century later, we're still asking the same questions.
Exact.
So is there anything we can learn from the 1920s that might help us deal with the challenges we're facing now?
I think so. One big takeaway is that progress isn't always like a straight line. The 1920s showed us that you can have these huge economic booms and then, bam, a devastating crash.
Like a roller coaster.
Yeah. So we have to be really careful about unchecked growth and, all the speculation that comes with it.
Especially in our current world, right? Everything's moving so fast with all the technology and stuff.
For sure. The 1920s also showed us how social and economic forces are totally intertwined.
How so?
Well, the rise of consumerism, driven by mass production and advertising, it had a huge impact on people's lives, both good and bad.
Makes sense.
Does that resonate with you at all?
Totally. I mean, we're still dealing with the effects of consumer culture today. We're more aware of the environmental impact of all the stuff we buy, but at the same time, we're bombarded with even more advertising than ever before.
Right. It's this constant struggle, like trying to find some kind of balance.
Okay, so what about all the cultural stuff that happened in the 1920s? The flappers, jazz music, the Harlem Renaissance. Do you see any connections to the cultural movements happening today?
What's interesting is that back in the 1920s, there was this huge clash between, like, traditional values and this desire for more individual freedom.
Yeah, and people wanting to express themselves however they wanted.
Right. And we're kind of seeing the same tension today, I think. All the debates about social justice, identity, the role of technology, it's all connected.
So maybe the lesson isn't about finding easy answers, but about being open to different perspectives and understanding the complexities of it all.
I think you're spot on. The 1920s, with all its contradictions and ups and downs, it can teach us a lot about how to deal with the challenges of our own time. It reminds us that history isn't just a bunch of dates and facts in a textbook. It's about real people, their experiences, their successes, their failures.
It's about humanity.
Exactly.
Right.
And we can learn so much from that.
This has been a really amazing deep dive. So to our listeners out there, as you go about your day, think about how the 1920s are still present in your life.
Yeah. What connections do you see?
What lessons resonate with you? Maybe by asking those questions, we can all understand the past a little better and have a clearer vision for the future.
I like that.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through the Roaring Twenties. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.